You think you can hit a woman? I will end your career right now.
When the colonel shoved the federal prosecutor thinking she was just a regular woman, and what happened to the colonel after. The incident in front of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. took exactly 4 seconds to happen and 2 days to make national news. The second-floor hallway of the courthouse was the kind of institutional space that exists in every federal building of sufficient weight. Walls clad in beige marble, lighting good enough that nothing is obscured, but understated enough that no one mistakes the space for anything other than what it is. Floors with that specific resonance of stone corridors that make each pair of shoes announce their arrival before the person becomes visible. In that hallway, at 9:20 on a Monday morning in June, there were 6 people. 3 were courthouse staff, 2 clerks who had stepped out to grab coffee and were talking in the hall before heading back, and an intern who had arrived early and was waiting for his supervisor to grant him system access. The 4th was an attorney, bar number on the badge pinned to her blazer lapel, who had stepped out of a hearing room to take a call and was holding the phone to her ear, listening, with the posture of someone on a call that doesn't require much from her. The 5th was a journalist, Tyler Bennett from the Associated Press, who had come to the courthouse to cover a public interest hearing scheduled for 10, and who had arrived early out of habit, and who was, as was the practice of anyone who had been covering press from the field for years, holding his phone as a natural extension of his hand. The 6th person was Dr. Renata Fonseca. Renata Fonseca was 32 years old. She had joined the U.S. Department of Justice 5 years earlier, following a federal hiring process that had taken nearly 2 years from application to security clearance to first day, the kind of process that tests not just knowledge, but the ability to sustain a commitment during the time it takes for the system to confirm that the commitment was the right one. She had passed on her second application. On the first, she had made it through the written examination but hadn't cleared the final panel. She had taken that result with the clarity of someone who processes a difficult piece of information and decides what to do with it before deciding how to feel about it. She went back to studying. She revisited the weak points she had identified in the panel. She prepared differently. She passed on the second. She was a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Her primary caseload involved federal crimes. Specifically, she was part of a task force investigating the misuse of federal appropriations that had been established 2 years prior, and that was, on the morning of that particular Monday, in a delicate phase of a case that had taken 18 months of investigation to reach its current stage. She had arrived at the courthouse at 8:50. She had gone straight to the second floor. She had stopped in the hallway to respond to an urgent message from her paralegal about documentation that had been requested by the presiding judge, and that had arrived with an inconsistency that needed clarification before the 11 o'clock hearing. She was holding her phone, reading and responding, when she heard the footsteps. Colonel Harold Stratton entered the courthouse at 9:18. He was 51. He had entered the Army at 18, had risen to the rank of colonel through a path that included training at West Point, graduate coursework at the Army War College, and a series of administrative assignments that had built a profile of an officer who knew how to navigate institutional bureaucracy efficiently, and who had learned over the years that the uniform opened doors that one's name sometimes didn't. The uniform opened doors. It wasn't a moral observation. It was an empirical one that anyone who had spent enough time inside hierarchical institutions had made. The uniform communicated rank before introductions, communicated authority before conversation, and in the hallways of public institutions where most interactions were brief and without prior context, the uniform functioned as a signaling system that created clearance without having to ask for it. He had developed over the years a way of walking compatible with this: firm step, squared shoulders, eyes forward, a posture that wasn't arrogance in the physical sense, but that produced, in the spaces it moved through, an effect of clear trajectory that people tended to respect laterally, without calculating whether they were going to or not. He had come to the courthouse for an administrative matter. An Army-owned property was involved in a land-use regulatory process that had generated a legal notice, and he had been designated as the representative to follow up, because the property was under his administrative jurisdiction. The matter called for a meeting with a judge's clerk, not a formal hearing, probably 15 to 20 minutes of documentation presentation. He went up to the second floor. He entered the hallway. There was a woman standing in the middle of the hallway, around 30 by the look of her. Simple clothes, beige blouse, black slacks, leather flats, hair pulled back in a low bun. No badge, no lanyard, nothing that would signal any particular role to eyes that hadn't taken the time or the interest to look. She was holding her phone, eyes down, focused on the screen. She was in the center of the hallway, not against the wall, not off to the side, but in the space where people walked through. Colonel Harold Stratton was in a hurry. Not emergency hurry. The hurry of a man who has multiple things in his day and who has already mentally calculated that the 10-minute meeting was going to run longer than 10 minutes because meetings in courthouses rarely run on schedule, and therefore every minute lost in the hallway was a minute less of margin in the rest of the day. "Move," he said. The woman didn't move immediately. She had her eyes on her phone. She had heard, she had because she blinked slightly at the word, but she hadn't responded at the speed he expected. Or she had responded and decided that the tone didn't justify the urgency the tone implied. The colonel didn't wait. He extended his arm and pushed her shoulder to the side. 4 seconds. 4 seconds between the word and the gesture, and inside those 4 seconds was a sequence that, for those watching from the outside, had produced the kind of momentary paralysis that happens when the brain receives information that doesn't fit any available category, and that needs an extra second to find a new one. Tyler Bennett had raised his phone before the paralysis ended. He hadn't planned it. It was the reflex of 5 years covering public spaces with a phone in hand, the reflex of someone who had captured important things because he was ready and missed important things because he wasn't, and who had arrived at the practical conclusion that a phone ready to record is the insignificant cost compared to the cost of missing something. He had recorded. The woman lowered her phone. She turned to face the colonel. There was a 2-second silence as she looked at him with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something harder to name than anger, the expression of someone who received something they hadn't asked for and who is, in that second, making the most important decision available, what to do with what they received. "You just shoved a federal prosecutor in the hallway of a federal courthouse," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, no tremor, no increase in volume. There was that kind of calm that is fundamentally different from the calm of someone containing themselves. It was the calm of someone who doesn't need volume because what she's saying already has enough weight without additional elements. "I'm Dr. Renata Fonseca, Assistant U.S. Attorney. What you just did has a name in the Federal Criminal Code." The colonel went still. There were, at that moment, 6 pairs of eyes in the hallway. The intern who had stopped with his coffee in hand. The 2 clerks who had paused their conversation. The attorney who had lowered the phone from her ear. The journalist who had raised his phone. And the colonel who was looking at Dr. Fonseca with an expression that was being visually recalibrated in real time, because he had entered that hallway reading the situation as a woman in his path, and the reading had shifted abruptly to something his system had not anticipated. Dr. Fonseca didn't waste a second. She had, over 5 years as a federal prosecutor, processed confrontational situations with enough regularity that the sequence of actions following an incident was an automatic structure, not a real-time decision. The structure was identify what happened, document, engage the correct channel, act within protocol. She called the courthouse security officer who was at the far end of the hallway. She asked him to accompany her and the colonel to the clerk's office to file an incident report. She formally requested a copy of the security camera footage from the hallway. The courthouse had cameras, and the second-floor hallway was one of the covered points. She sent a formal incident notification to her supervisor via written message with timestamp and description of events. She did all of this with the same rhythm she had used every other time she'd needed to document something in real time. No hurry that would create imprecision, no slowness that would mean loss of moment. The colonel accompanied her. He accompanied her because he had in those minutes understood that the structure had inverted. that the person who had been in the hallway as an obstacle had become, in 4 seconds, the person who held the institutional weight in the situation. Tyler Bennett's video had been sent to the AP desk at 9:40. It had been verified, edited for context, and published at 11:30. It reached Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp in that order. The natural circulation pattern for content that has the specific combination of visible institutional authority, clear physical gesture, and a reaction that defies the expectation of whoever is watching. The image was clear, the push was evident, the colonel was identifiable, and Dr. Fonseca's reaction was calm in a way that became more visible by contrast with what had prompted it. By 3 p.m., the Department of the Army's press office had received requests for comment. By 5, the U.S. Attorney's Office for D.C. had responded, confirming that an incident report had been filed and that Dr. Fonseca had taken all appropriate measures. At 8 p.m., CNN had included the video in its evening coverage with a segment that ran 11 minutes. The internal investigation had been opened by the Justice Department the following day, not by Dr. Fonseca. There was a direct conflict of interest and protocol was clear. Cases where DOJ personnel are directly affected are investigated by a colleague without personal connection to the case. Dr. Marcus Webb, a fellow assistant U.S. attorney in the same office, was assigned to lead the inquiry. Colonel Harold Stratton faced 2 parallel proceedings, an internal one in the Army under the Uniform Code of Military Justice provisions covering conduct unbecoming an officer. There was a specific article addressing public conduct that generated negative institutional exposure, and an external one, a civil lawsuit for damages and emotional distress that Dr. Fonseca filed with the same rigor as any other case she had carried in her career. She hadn't filed it for the damages. There were cases in federal practice where civil tort action was purely an instrumental strategy, and she had heard attorneys argue that the symbolic weight of the suit was sufficient to make the point without the full formal process. She had heard those arguments, she had disagreed. The case is the message, she had said to Marcus in a conversation one afternoon about strategy, not the judgment amount. The case itself, the documentation, the depositions, the formal record that this happened and that the consequences were proportionate. That's the point. The conciliation hearing had been scheduled for a Friday in September. It had been cancelled on the preceding Wednesday because the colonel had submitted a formal written apology, a letter drafted with attorney assistance, using language that acknowledged inadequate conduct, stated personal responsibility, and requested extrajudicial closure of the civil matter. Dr. Fonseca had received the letter. She read it twice. She gave it 2 days. Not because she was uncertain about what to do. She was clear about what had happened, and clear about what the letter represented. She gave it 2 days because there was a distinction she wanted to make consciously. The distinction between accepting an apology because it was genuine and sufficient, and accepting one because it was convenient to accept. The apology seemed genuine. She consulted Marcus. "I'll accept," she told Marcus on the morning of the 3rd day. "Dismiss," he said. "Dismiss the civil," said Renata. "The Army's internal proceeding is theirs. That's not my decision." The Army's internal proceeding resulted 3 months later in an administrative sanction that became part of the colonel's official record, not dismissal, not loss of rank, but a formal sanction that created a permanent mark in his disciplinary history and that affected, depending on how his career proceeded, future promotion eligibility. Colonel Stratton had requested a transfer to a different installation 6 weeks after the sanction. The transfer was approved. On a Tuesday in November, 5 weeks after the civil case was dismissed, Dr. Fonseca received a call from a journalist at the Washington Post who was working on a profile of women in federal prosecution. In the interview, which lasted an hour and 20 minutes, the journalist asked the question Renata had expected. "Many people admired the composure you showed in that moment. What was going through your head?" Renata held the question for a second. "Documentation," she said. "I was cataloguing what had happened, who was in the hallway, which would be the correct channel for action. It wasn't calm in an emotional sense. It was focus on procedure. Emotionally? Emotionally came later. That afternoon when I got home, She paused. But what I felt emotionally didn't change anything that was available for me to do in that moment. The procedure exists precisely so that what's available to do doesn't depend on the emotional state of the person who was affected. The journalist was quiet for a second. What did you conclude about the incident, looking back with the distance of time? That procedure works when you know it and when you apply it without letting the emotional urgency of the moment replace the steps. She paused. And that the person standing in that hallway 20 minutes after opening the incident file already had the proper documentation to ensure that this wouldn't depend solely on my word. Tyler Bennett had published a personal opinion piece 3 weeks after the incident about what he had witnessed. He called it "The Difference Between Reaction and Response." In the piece, he described what he had seen, not just the incident itself, but the sequence that followed, the precision with which Dr. Fonseca had managed the 10 minutes afterward, and the way her presence of mind had imposed a structure on the hallway that transformed a potentially chaotic incident into a documented, controlled sequence. He wrote at the end of the piece, "There's a difference between reaction and response that's hard to articulate until you see it. Reaction is what comes out when there's no structure. Response is what comes out when the structure is so deeply internalized that it operates even without time to deliberate. What I saw in that hallway was a response, and what made the response possible were years of work that don't appear in the video. They appear only in what the video can't show, the 10 minutes after the camera stopped recording." Dr. Fonseca had read the piece on a Saturday morning with her coffee. She had stayed with the last sentence. The 10 minutes after the camera stopped recording. It was exactly what she had said to Marcus about the case, that the case was the message, the same thing from a different angle. There was one thing that no one had asked in the coverage, or had asked and never received an answer, because Renata had chosen not to give a public one. The thing was this: what she had done in the 45 minutes between the incident and the 11 o'clock hearing. She had done what she had planned to do since 8:50. She had gone to the hearing room. She had delivered the documentation to the judge's clerk. She had participated in the hearing. She had been present in that hearing for 2 hours, with the documentation she had prepared, with the argument she had refined the week before, and she had reached the result she had pursued. A favorable decision moving the case in the direction she had argued for from the start. She had left the hearing at 1 p.m. She had called Marcus to update him on the status of the investigation. She had eaten a sandwich from the courthouse cafeteria while reading the next case in the queue. It had been, in the final accounting of the day, a normal workday, with an incident at 9:20 that had lasted 4 seconds and that had occupied, in terms of concrete response time and procedure, about 45 minutes of the total. The other 7 hours and 15 minutes had been work. There was something Renata had carried from the situation that she hadn't been able to articulate publicly, because articulating it publicly would have required a level of exposure that had not been necessary for the case and that she had chosen to keep private. What she had carried was this: there was a moment inside those 4 seconds between the word and the gesture in which she had perceived what was about to happen. She had perceived it because she had heard the step, had heard the air move, and there had existed in her for a fraction of a second the awareness that a choice was available: move out of the way. She had stayed, not out of stubbornness, not out of territorial defense. She had stayed because she had been doing what she was doing, responding to a work message in a public space, and the idea that her presence in that space required justification or anticipatory movement for another person had not seemed, in that fraction of a second, like an idea that should guide her behavior. It was a fraction of a second. It had made all the difference. In the spring following the incident, the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys had added a module to onboarding programs for new DOJ prosecutors covering procedures for incidents in public spaces. The module had been developed in consultation with Renata's team, not directly by her, but with her team's input on what had worked in the incident's aftermath. The module's title was Procedure and Documentation: How Structure Turns an Incident into a Record. The corridor incident wasn't referenced by name, but those who had heard of the case and most incoming attorneys had because the video had circulated enough to become part of the institution's recent memory, recognized the origin when they read the content. It had been suggested to Renata by a colleague in the Philadelphia office that she lead this module herself. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it. "No," she said 3 weeks later. "Not because I don't want to contribute, but because I don't think my presence in the module helps. What happened wasn't exceptional. It was procedure applied. And framing it as exceptional, even for positive reasons, works against the message the module is trying to send." Her colleague sat with that. "Then who leads it?" "Someone who wasn't there," Renata said. "Because then it's clear that what matters isn't who the person in that hallway was. It's what any person who knows the procedure can do when the procedure is needed." Colonel Harold Stratton had retired 22 months after the incident. He left the Army at the rank he held, without promotion in his final months, with an official record that carried a mark that hadn't been there before a Monday morning in June, in a beige marble hallway in Washington, D.C. He moved to a small town in Vermont, near where he had grown up. He gave no interviews about the incident. Tyler Bennett continued covering the courthouse. In the months after the incident, he developed a practice he described to a colleague as the 10-minute rule, the practice of, in any situation he was covering, staying in the space for 10 minutes past what appeared to be the end of the event. He found, over time, that the 10 minutes after frequently contained the most important information, not the prepared statement, not the gesture calibrated for camera, but what happened when people thought the observation had ended. He wrote 2 stories from things he had seen in the 10 minutes after. One won an investigative reporting award. He dedicated it to Dr. Fonseca in a low-key Instagram post with the caption, "I learned the value of the 10 minutes after in a beige marble hallway. Thank you." She saw the post. She liked it. That was all. There was one last thing. Renata had walked through that hallway twice in the months following the incident, for work reasons, not by specific choice. The courthouse was part of her routine, and the second-floor hallway was the path to rooms where she had regular hearings and meetings. The first time she passed through the spot where she had been standing without consciously registering that it was the same point. The second time she noticed, she stopped at the spot for a second, not to mark anything, not for any symbolic gesture. She stopped because she had noticed, and noticing without pausing for a second before moving on had felt like an erasure that wasn't necessary. She stayed for the second. She moved on. The beige marble hallway kept being the beige marble hallway, and the work kept being the work. It was enough, and it had always been exactly that. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone you admire, who doesn't need to raise their voice to command respect. And tell us in the comments, have you ever responded to an injustice not with anger but with method, and what happened after?